took more than 3,600 hours, 151 days, 50 cans of spray foam, a full sack of mortar, and almost 2 gallons of epoxy to make the coolest terrarium ever for my pet boa constrictor Willy. In this video, I go through every step I took and show you exactly what I did from start to finish, including things that didn't go exactly as planned. So if you love DIY projects as much as I do, be sure to stick around to the very end. For the last several months, and definitely for the last several videos, I've been going over exactly how I built my giant terrarium. In most of my videos, I go into specific details about a certain aspect of the project. But in this one, I want to give an overview of the whole process. This whole project really started with a bit of dumpster diving. Basically, I spotted some tempered glass on the road that looked pretty cool, and my first instinct was, hey, I can make a terrarium out of that. But tempered glass is heat treated, which means you'll never change it unless your goal is to turn it into a million little tiny glass pieces. That's when I abandoned the idea of picking up glass out of a dumpster and started on the odyssey of designing my own terrarium. My whole point was to give Willy, my 2.5 meter, 10 kilogram boa constrictor, a better place to live. At 12 years old, Willy really needed more space. I'd never made a terrarium so big, so I knew I had my work cut out for me. And I knew the first step of any great project would be a great plan. The first thing I did was search for examples that would give me some ideas of the directions I wanted to go. YouTube was a great source to see all sorts of really cool ideas like waterfalls, cool foam backgrounds, and all sorts of new approaches. I figured it would take some time to build, so the next step was to figure out how to capture those ideas so I didn't forget any important details. As I go over my video on building the foam background, trying to capture these ideas in clay really wasn't the right direction. What I needed was a virtual solution. I searched around and found an online program called Tinkercad. And the cool thing about doing everything digitally first is you don't destroy things and make yourself angry and poor. I had already worked on Willy's old terrarium, so I had a head start on at least some things, but it was clear I was gonna have to come up with a lot of new ideas. This guy here is 120 centimeters long. You can't just make something 2.5 meters long and have no support. Doubling the size of that glass definitely would not work. After checking out so many ideas, the shopping list that I was talking about earlier actually wasn't all that complicated. Mostly, I just wanted something that was going to be super big and look cool enough I could put it right in the middle of the house without everybody getting mad at me. And, of course, would have a cool waterfall.
Excellent.
Keeping these simple points in mind, I spent the next couple of weeks just playing around with new approaches and new designs to try to capture all these ideas into one detailed blueprint I could use as a guide for my entire build. There were so many details, but the cool thing is, with CAD, you get all these precise measurements. So my terrarium was going to be mostly glass, had a minor aluminum frame, had a wooden stand, and most importantly, had a cool waterfall background. Oh yeah, and was 2.5 meters long by 2 meters tall and had a capacity of almost 4,000 liters. I had the plan, now I just had to build it.
In 400 meters, at the roundabout, take the first exit.
Just driving back from Germany. As soon as we get back, it's gonna be like Christmas time. Since it would be such an important part of the terrarium, one of the first things I got was the aluminum profile that would hold all the glass in place. All the profile I found locally kind of looked like Tinker Toys, which wasn't what I was after. So based on the recommendations of my friend Sven, the German monitor lizard guy, I ordered all of the aluminum pieces and all the fittings I would need for my design from a place called Marine Systems in Germany. There were cheaper options available, but they cut everything to order, and the design was a simple, classy look, which is exactly what I was after. Plus, everything came packed really well. Next, I picked up the super heavy plywood that would form the floor and the backboard of the terrarium. That's some nice stuff. And of course, the glass, finally! These are the skylights, the side panels, the doors. This is all 6mm pretty tough stuff. This is 4mm glass. Having a Tinkercad blueprint was fantastic because I could get all these pieces cut ahead of time and set about getting all the other pieces I would need for my build. A bond liner from the UK, wood from the local hardware store, mortar from another hardware store, spray foam, epoxy, dry lock, and a million other little gadgets and widgets from the cheapest place in the world, AliExpress. It took a bit of time to get all the pieces together, but once I finally did, the only question that remained was how I was going to get this build started in here. It didn't take very long to realize that the right place to start would be the stand, because without the stand, the terrarium wouldn't really have a leg to stand on. My design for the terrarium stand was based pretty much on a stand I had made for Willy's old terrarium, just with a bunch of improvements. This part of the project was super satisfying because it went by really fast and I was done with the majority of the stand in only a couple of days. I go over all the details of building the stand in another video. Be sure to check that one out. With the stand built, the next step, and really the first step of the actual terrarium, was to add the floor. 15 layer thick, 21 millimeter birch plywood. That is a big old piece of plywood. My terrarium design had a lot of glass, but not much frame, so it was really important that the floor and the background were super strong, super flat, and super stiff. The birch plywood provided all these things, and on top of that, it was water, rot, and boil resistant. That's why I used it both for the floor and for the backboard that would support the eventual foam background. One drawback of this super plywood is also that it's super heavy. That meant I had to be especially careful to support the back really well. I'll come back to this a little bit later in the video. I wanted to be sure there'd be space for electrical wiring behind, so I cut some notches into the floor so the back panel would be inset just a bit. The notches were pretty small, so a jigsaw was the ideal tool for this. With the notches cut in place, I could position the floor exactly where it would be in the final build. This was really important because my next step was to attack the pond. A big part of my design was to have a soaking pool for Willy that held about 45 or 50 liters of water. I planned to sink the pond into the floor of the terrarium, and then this way it would give me easy access to the pumps, the tubing, the heater, and all those things that didn't look so cool and keep them hidden in the stand. So my next step was to use the actual pond as a guide to mark where the pool would eventually be. With the floor and pool upside down, I used a pin to indicate exactly where I'd need to cut a hole. And after making an allowance for the lip of the pond, it was time to get cutting. 21mm birch plywood isn't exactly cheap stuff. It was pretty nerve-wracking attacking this thing freestyle with the jigsaw, but everything came out absolutely perfectly, as long as you don't count that little cut into the bench I made underneath. Perfect! But just having a hole in the floor wasn't enough to support the whole pond. I also had a shelf inside the stand. This was super important because water's heavy, and once filled, this pond was going to weigh almost as much as a person. And just as important as weight was the juncture between the pool and the terrarium floor. This not only had to be watertight, but I also wanted it to look natural and not just like a black polyethylene bucket. Plus, the pond liner was kind of floppy. Of course, I could have built the pond and the background into one giant piece, but that would have meant I would never get the thing out of my house again. In fact, I had designed the size of the background and the floor to be just big enough to fit out the biggest window in the house. So my solution was to make a false floor. By using a second piece of wood with a hole cut into it just like the terrarium floor, I could mount the pool in a fixed and rigid way and yet still be able to remove it whenever I wanted. With the pond permanently attached to something rigid, I could build the background and, importantly, the high water line to make it look as realistic as possible and at the same time ensure it was 100% watertight. I chose to make this false floor out of OSB or oriented strand particle board. It's not so expensive and I didn't need all the strength of the plywood. All I needed to do was cut a hole in the OSB and mount the pond into place. And even though I planned to cover all this with foam and mortar, I coated it with epoxy just in case. Where the pool contacted the wood, I laid down first a layer of silicone caulking. Even though the silicone doesn't adhere to polyurethane, when it was cured, it would still form a watertight gasket. And just to be sure, I followed this up with some tiny wood screws to hold everything in place. Now that I had the support and the structure of the pond fully resolved, I could move on to installing the background. As I mentioned earlier, this wood was really heavy, so it was important to support correctly. That's exactly why I cut those notches into the floor. They aligned perfectly with the strongest members of the stand, so that allowed me to attach support structures from the back. I initially used temporary scrap wood for this, but I eventually replaced them with the final plywood structures. The aluminum frame would connect directly to this backboard, so to be sure it was super secure, I carefully cut some notches into the backboard before I installed it into place. And while I still had my tools out, I also added some temporary supports on the sides to ensure the heavy glass side panels wouldn't fall as I assembled everything later. The build was coming together really nicely. With the background support in place, I could finally start with the aluminum frame and simultaneously the foam background, which I'll get to later in this video. The aluminum structure was critical as it formed the connection between the fragile and somewhat unforgiving glass and the rest of the terrarium, including the ventilation systems. Good ventilation was always a primary concern, so I built in 3 different ways to get fresh air. The front vents, which were passive, the top vents, which were also passive, and the rear suction fan that was active. The front and top vents were based on perforated aluminum and would be pretty visible, but the fan would be hidden behind the tree and operate automatically according to the sensors. Like the water systems, I go over these in a lot more detail in another video, so be sure to check that one out. But coming back to the aluminum frame, the front section was essentially just a long bar of aluminum where I could mount the rails for the sliding glass door, and this in turn was held up by stanchions. They didn't make any fittings to attach these stanchions where I wanted them, so I cut a few small wood cores that would fit snugly just inside the end of each aluminum support. This way, I could easily attach each stanchion from the underside using a wood screw, and the wood would expand to hold it tight. That screw there goes up in the center. As that wood screw cinches down, it makes the plug expand and makes this really, really solid. Outside of this though, the fittings that come with this system are really easy to put together, so in almost no time at all, I had the rest of the basic frame completely finished. I was a bit nervous at first that the frame wouldn't fit into the notches I had cut, but everything fit together absolutely perfectly. And with the frame in place, I could move on to finishing the ventilation system underneath the sliding glass doors. You can see this line here. This is where there will be a vertical piece of this super hard core and then ventilation screen here. So I want to get the background placed to make sure that everything fits. I can cut the tree, but if I can avoid that, that's great. All during this project, I did a lot of dry fitting and testing of materials before I installed them permanently in place. Even planning carefully with Tinkercad, I still changed my mind about some things along the way, and I still made a few mistakes. I'm on the way back from Germany. I got a couple of more pieces of aluminum profiles. I kind of mismeasured some of the aluminum profile that went across the top. These kind of changes are part of the real life of making real DIY projects. Some people even say that just as important as plans are the solutions you find when things don't come out exactly as you imagined.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
Whatever the case, there was more than one occasion where I was super happy that I was still in the dry fitting stage rather than having to undo a lot of things that I had fixed in permanently. At this stage, I tested out the aluminum runners that would hold the sliding glass doors, but I didn't install them permanently in place. There was still a lot of work to do with the foam background. I wanted to be sure they would stay protected. I'll come back to the sliding glass doors later in this video, but it's important to point out that I worked on many aspects of my terrarium simultaneously. For example, all during the time that I was working on this aluminum frame, I was also building up my foam background and my realistic artificial tree. Because I planned from the beginning to have all these parts removable, I could work on them separately and simultaneously as I built up the main enclosure. For the realistic tree, I first built up a basic structure on a trash can using spray foam, carved it carefully, and then covered it with bark molded from a real tree. This included a heated basking area on top, as well as a light inside, all controllable using my iPhone. This was a really exciting part of the build for me, so if you're interested in this, be sure to check out the video series I made that details all the steps I took. And for the background of the terrarium, I first built up an XPS foam support structure that would form kind of a removable false wall. I then built up a huge structure out of spray polyurethane foam using over 50 cans of spray foam. And during this process, I carefully built the waterfall that would connect to the water systems I described next. And to get a totally realistic rock look, I covered it with several layers of tinted mortar and then finally a layer of epoxy so it would be watertight. Just like the tree, the background was a super challenging and really interesting part of my final build. I also made a full series on this as well, so be sure to check it out. With the floor background and pool installed, the next step was to go through all the plumbing and ensure that everything was removable and replaceable. The core of my water system would be a big canister filter to both filter the pond and drive the waterfall over the back. From this filter and pool unit, I connected the waterfall using silicone tubing up the back and insulated the pond so it wouldn't lose heat. The water system was pretty complicated and there are a lot of things involved, so I go over this in details in another video. Coming back to the main build, with the basic aluminum frame in place, I could start thinking about the glass. My plan was that the sides would sit directly on the edge of the terrarium floor, so all I needed were some aluminum rails above and below to keep the glass from slipping out. I held these in place using Poly Max, a super strong adhesive that cures really fast and unlike epoxy, stays flexible. I like to think of it like a super hard silicone.
or even like a hot glue that actually is useful.
These little rails on the top and bottom were all I used to hold the side glass panels in place. Using glue or silicone would have been much easier and faster, but a major goal for my build was to make my terrarium modular and ultimately movable. I planned every piece in my design to work with the other pieces so it all kind of fit together like a puzzle. This was sometimes tricky for some parts, which were not only very heavy, but also could be really dangerous if they were to fall, like glass. At this stage, things were coming together great, and I had advanced enough with the foam background to be able to temporarily mount the upper pieces to cut notches to fit the aluminum frame. Of course, this was still kind of a dry-fitting step, so I had to use an aluminum pole in the center just to make sure things didn't fall down. Even though this is a temporary step, this was a super exciting part of my build because this is the first time that I started seeing all these pieces come together for the very first time, especially the glass.
Well, this is a very exciting and proud moment for me. Finally put in the two sides of glass and the top. Things fit absolutely snugly and perfectly.
The one thing I wasn't totally sure about was whether I should keep that aluminum pole I had used for temporarily holding up the ceiling while I was assembling the frame.
With the side pieces in place, it may be strong enough to hold itself. It all depends on the rigidity of that attachment point.
The aluminum profile was super rigid, and the sliding glass doors in front would certainly hold up the ceiling, and I always wanted a frameless design. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like all that weight of glass overhead was a pretty big risk without a good support. In the end, I decided to just attach this support permanently. It added a little more aluminum frame than I originally planned, but with glass this heavy, it's better to be safe than sorry. You'll notice that I wrapped certain parts that would be really visible in the final build with plastic wrap. I did this to protect them against any glues, paints, and any other accidents that might happen along the way. It takes a bit of time to work this way, but I find it's well worth it. Nothing's worse than finishing a final build after so many months, only to find it's already damaged. With the aluminum frame and the glass panels in place, I could focus on making little adjustments to the background and the tree that I had been building separately to make sure everything locked together.
There's a little bit of a crack just between the edge of the background and the glass. What I've got to do is go in with a little bit of this spray foam. I've got the glass wrapped in plastic wrap that keeps the foam from sticking to it, and put a little bit of a line here.
Ensuring the background and the tree butted right up against the glass wasn't just a question of aesthetics. It was really important to make sure that Willy couldn't possibly get behind the background. I had to fill these gaps in several steps. It was a bit tricky adding just enough foam that would help fill the gap, yet not so much that would force the glass out of place before the foam cured.
Be very careful with this stuff. It can actually push the glass and bow the glass out. I've broken 2 pieces of glass by the exact same stupid mistake, not being careful about how much foam expands.
At this stage, I also adapted the background panels to make sure the fog pipes would come into the terrarium exactly where they needed to be. You can check out my video on control systems for more on this. Now I was sure the aluminum frame, the background, the tree, and the side glass all fit in place, I was ready to address the main door structure. It was really important to me to be able to completely open the terrarium, so sliding glass doors that could be totally removed was a perfect solution. And a cool thing about Marine Systems is they offer kits that perfectly match the aluminum frames they provide. Their kits are super easy to install. You just have to mount running rails above and below the glass, a running shoe on the glass, some rollers, end pieces, some rattle protection, and that's it.
Check this out. Pure gravity.
With the sliding glass doors in place, I was pretty excited because things were starting to move into the home stretch, and now I could start focusing on the top of the terrarium.
What we've got to do is attach the glass to the frame so that the glass doesn't get pushed out when Willy pushes a little bit. There's simply a screw that can be hand tightened, and what I'm going to do is mount just 1 or 2 of these in each key point, and then use this, which is a thread borer, and that'll put some threads directly into the aluminum so I can tighten the screws directly in.
The drilling and tapping for the thumb screws went a lot easier than I thought. I just had to use a little bit of oil to make sure the thread tap didn't get stuck. Once I had all the thumb screws drilled and tapped, I could then carefully cut out the aluminum pieces that would both support the glass on top and allow air to pass through. I don't really have a table saw at my place, so I had to do all this cutting with my Dremel, which took a while, but still worked fine in the end. And importantly, I filed down the edges because the aluminum can really get sharp and cut.
just on the edge, I've mounted some aluminum profiles so that it can hook into the glass. This enables me to completely take the glass in and out, simply laying it and connecting the glass in here.
I had planned this out on CAD, but I hadn't really made anything like this before. So when I put everything together and put all the thumb screws in place, I was really happy that it all worked perfectly.
Here's a close-up of how this glass holds together into the support for the ventilation screen. The thumb screw simply goes right into the hole that I drilled yesterday and threaded. So these simply hold one on each side of the screen. This is raised a little bit in the middle by the edge of the aluminum profile. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of a rubber knob in the side, and hopefully that will keep things from rattling.
Even though I used 6mm glass for the walls and doors of the terrarium, to reduce weight, I decided to use 4mm glass for each of the 4 ceiling panels. And to reduce risks of cracking the glass, I added a little felt disc to each of the thumb screws. The whole idea was that by using no glues, I could easily remove the panels anytime for cleaning or transport. At this stage, I was pretty sure all the pieces fit together more or less perfectly. But once the background foam was in place, it'd be very hard to check if there were any leaks behind it. And even though I used marine quality birch, I was a bit concerned that if I got wood rot somewhere I couldn't see, that could be bad. So just to play things as safe as possible, I decided to coat the entire inside of the terrarium with a rubber sealant. Of course, this meant disassembling everything.
The background is now off into the winter garden where I can start putting epoxy on it. This compound is a flexible kind of rubbery thing that I want to cover the entire floor and as much of the background with. Make really sure that this thing is watertight.
Because I had planned the terrarium from the beginning to be super transportable, it wasn't so difficult to take out the aluminum frame and the background and get painting. At this point, I really didn't need those lines on the back panel anymore. As I explained in my video on building the waterfall, they were super helpful to know exactly where to cut the background panels apart. But at this stage, all the screws were drilled and there was only one way things would fit.
It's been 10, 15, 20 hours since I coated the surface. It's still a little bit tacky. It's got a good rubbery surface. I've decided to go ahead and do yet another coat.
I figured one coat on the back was enough, but I added 2 on the floor just in case. If it were easy to get in Switzerland, I definitely would have used Flex Seal for this step. It's well known to be non-toxic and totally safe for terrariums. Unfortunately, at least currently, Flex Seal isn't sold in Switzerland. The only product that I could find that was kind of similar, like a portable silicone, was this MEM Water Stop. It's just a bit thinner, brownish red, and kind of stinks when you paint it on. A really big drawback of this stuff though is it's not certified safe for drinking water. This wouldn't really be a problem in my terrarium, as there wouldn't be any water in these areas. But just to be sure, I covered the entire floor surface with a layer of sheet vinyl flooring. It was probably overkill. At the same time, I would have been much happier to use only products I was 100% sure were animal and plant safe, no matter what.
Today is a very special day because, in fact, finally, we've got the background put back onto the stand.
Installing the very first background piece was definitely the most challenging because it was the largest and had the waterfall in it. Plus, I needed to run wires for the heated shelf out the back, as well as make sure that 2 of the 3 fog outputs were perfectly aligned. Fortunately, the other panels were a lot easier to install. It was a little bit like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle, but even cooler because I saw my entire background come to life as I built it. Using a flashlight, I carefully aligned the final fog output that would deliver the high treetops fog. After triple checking to be 100% sure the glass sides still fit and everything was aligned perfectly, I fixed the panels in place using long wood screws from the back. As I explained in my video on building the background, I had carefully embedded OSB wood panels into each background piece so I'd have a secure place to attach the screws. The tree was the last piece to go in. It had a heated element on top, so I needed to feed the wires carefully through the background and out the back. The active part of the ventilation system, the fan, was positioned just behind the tree so it would be hidden once the tree was put into place. The next step was to install the aluminum frame I had built earlier, including the passive ventilation system. The intake is perforated aluminum just inside the sliding glass doors. On the inside, it sits on a barrier made of resipol, which is pretty much like a super stiff waterproof particle board. It's held in place on the bottom and the top using aluminum U-rail, just like the side glass. As the air heats up during the day and it rises, cool air is drawn into the lower vents, then passes out through the top screening. This creates a natural draft that ensures the air is always fresh. Of course, I still have the active ventilation fan, but this way, with the passive system in place, I can run or not run that fan to control the humidity or temperature without having to worry about ventilation. Installing the aluminum frame structure was pretty straightforward because it fit really snugly over the background board. All during installing the background panels, I had carefully run the electrical wires for the spotlight, heated cave, the fan, the lights, and the tree all out the back. Using zip ties, I carefully bundled the wires together and ran them through PVC pipes to keep everything clean and well organized. These little details might take a little bit of time during the build, but this way you don't wind up tripping over your work later, repairs are far easier to make, and it just looks nicer. With the wiring done, I could finally move on to installing the glass sides and top. As I explained earlier, the 6mm side glass panels sit in runners made from aluminum U-channel. They're not glued in place at all. In this way, they're easily removed whenever I want to take apart the terrarium and move it in the future. It was really important though to make sure the glass was well seated in place, so I carefully hung with all my weight on the top rail to make sure everything was super snug. And after that, all I needed was one quick screw from each top corner and the aluminum glass structure was locked securely in place. Installing the final top glass was pretty straightforward as I had already prepared all the pieces. I just needed to start laying in the first glass panels. As I explained earlier, each of the 4 top panels of glass is held firmly in place by a thumb screw at either end. The rest of the glass is supported by the aluminum U-channel of the passive ventilation system. It all kind of locks together. And as a final step, as I mentioned earlier, I added a little pad of soft rubber under each corner of the glass just to keep it from rattling. The build was getting so close, I couldn't wait to show Willy his new home. With the top glass in place, I could now connect the overhead lights. As I explained in my video on the control systems, these lights were programmed to come on slowly with the sunrise. Not only does the intensity of the light change, but the color does too, ultimately ending with a red sunset, just like natural light. Things were getting really close. The next step was to install the sliding doors on the stand and then the white melamine cover that would give the whole terrarium stand a more final finished look. I decided to use melamine mostly because it was super cheap and the stand wouldn't normally get wet. But if you wanted something a little more waterproof, you could just as easily go with 4X or high density PVC foam board. It's just a bit more expensive. Even if you try to plan everything super carefully from the start, when you're building DIY projects, sometimes ideas just come mid-project. This was the case with the mister system. Once the whole terrarium was assembled, I just felt like adding natural rain would take things to the next level. So that's exactly what I did. I put a pause on things just for a moment to install the entire mister system. Be sure to check out the video where I go over this in all details. At this point in my build, the structure of the terrarium was essentially finished. The only thing left now was bringing everything to that next level with the right substrate and the right decorations. Of course, I wanted to have the most realistic environment possible for Willy, but at the same time, giant snakes can be pretty tough on live plants. So in the end, my solution was to use a combination of both real and real-looking items. To help break up the division between the background and the floor, I added rocks I made at the same time I was making the foam rock background. I think this really helps make the overall build look much more natural. On the background itself, I added a combination of both live and plastic bromeliads, ferns, irises, and even Spanish moss, all using the natural cracks as well as the potting holes I had built into the background earlier. On the floor of the terrarium, I built up a basis of shredded wood you can pick up in any pet store. And to this, I added a mixture of leaves and other natural products I collected from both outside and from my houseplants and carefully sterilized before adding them to the terrarium. I thought really carefully about making a full bioactive setup, but because giant snakes like Willy make so much waste at once, I kind of concluded that the cons of trying to maintain a full bioactive setup would far outweigh any benefits. Bottom line, every time a giant snake like Willy takes a dump, you're gonna have to clean that thing out. Leaning on pillbugs and springtails to do the heavy lifting for you might be expecting a little bit too much. In the pond, I initially tried living Alodia and other plants, but I found they soon fouled the water. Instead, I found it much easier to go with plastic duckweed, foam lily pads, and other artificial plants. In the end, they looked pretty real and could be easily taken out for cleaning. Real fish and frogs did join in the pool though, so be sure to check out my full video on this part, including when I got surprise frog eggs and I wound up with an entire frog family I didn't plan on. With everything in place, I was finally ready to mount the sliding glass doors on the runners and get the terrarium in place for Willy. Even though I hadn't planned it from the beginning, the door slid so easily I decided to add a lock, just to be sure the doors didn't accidentally open by themselves, or Willy might find a way.
They slide so easily, I think Willy could get himself out. I've got this. This also came from Marine Systems. Works by pushing a piston through both panes. Doors are closed. Locked. Got a key. And it opens.
After more than 6 months of trials and errors, 50 cans of spray foam, and flooding the whole place more than once, I had finally finished with my build.
After months of work, that's 10 kilos of boa constrictor, and that's why he's getting a new house. You better like this, Willy.
And the coolest part of all was Willy made himself at home right away.
It's humidifying right now because the humidity has dropped below what it should be right now. The whole idea is to have a bunch of different microclimates. This is his first warm spot, 45, even 50 degrees. And this is the cooler microclimate to hang out in. This water here, 26.3 degrees. Heater in the back. All the water is going through this Eheim Professional floor filter. This is a Betazooer fog machine that delivers the fog coming out of here, the cave, the top right. This is his second warm spot, 38 degrees. This has a little bit of a red light. This is heated only from the basking lamp. Right under here, there's another heating pad. There's a gradient of temperature that goes up to about 32 maximum, then it cools down to about 24. The humidity is measured here through the sensors here. These are all controlled through apps on the phone and scheduled through smart programming.
Now that I've finally finished my build, I'm super happy with the final results. But I can't really take credit for this stuff myself. I learned a huge amount from what other people have done and were cool enough to share online. Whether it's the German monitor lizard guy, Cam's custom background, Serpa design, Brad's bioactive builds, King of DIY, and so many YouTubers who maybe don't have a giant name, but still have awesome ideas. You guys all rock. If I were to do this project all over again, I think I would improve a few things. For example, I think I went overkill on the thickness of the floor and background and could have gotten away with half as thick. In the end, it just adds a lot of extra weight that I don't need. But that's kind of the thing about experience. You kind of get it right after you needed it the most. And with DIY projects, you kind of just gotta jump in with both feet and hope for the best.
Do or do not. There is no try.
I mentioned this earlier in the video, but I wish I had used Flex Seal earlier in my build than I actually did. In the end, I did actually get a can, but it was only by first asking my dad to pick it up in California, then having him fly it out to Portugal, where I packaged it up to mail it to Zurich, Switzerland before we flew out to the Canary Islands to do a scientific expedition. As I explained in my video on the waterfall, it was the only product that actually finally saved my waterfall from leaking all over the place and me pulling out all my hair trying to solve it. Okay guys, I think I'm gonna wrap up this video. I hope you had as much fun watching it as I did putting it together. I know it's a bit long, but I always like to share every step, because who knows, maybe I can help somebody else along the way. And don't forget to check out all the side projects that were all part of this final build. If you liked this video, please consider giving it a like, sharing it around, and maybe even subscribing. It's very much appreciated and helps the channel grow. Share video so it make me famous YouTuber so I take over world with big frog video. Bye!